welcome to Swiss Shoes Podcast. We're delighted to have Ciaran Crossin, Armin Scharlach, Peter Walmsley and Charlie Green, with myself, Bill Young, to discuss trust or trustworthiness is the topic for today. And to start us off, I'm going to ask Ciaran. Ciaran, what do you understand by trust and why is it important?
My understanding of trust is both through both a moral and an ethical lens. For me, trust is best, at its simplest definition, is saying what you're going to do and then actually doing it, following it through, whether that's something that has positive or negative outcomes for a person. Trust is for me, it's that you are sincere in how you in how you change your words into actions. What trust is not is people that say one thing and do another.
Thank you. Armin.
I will elaborate a little bit later about the connection between trust and game theory, which, as you know, is my field of passion. But let me start a little earlier. Let me start with my personal education, because I learned already as a kid about the importance of trust. When I then became a consultant, funny enough, without really intentionally doing so, that came a little bit into the background until then one day, and I was with Carney at this time, we all got in the entire organization a book, the Trusted Advisor, because someone had recognized what I had recognized with myself, that just being good in what you're doing because you know a lot of things is not necessarily convincing others to buy your services.
Super. Thanks, Armin. And Peter?
Yes, I think I'd go with Ciaran's definition initially to say that trust for me is somebody following through on what they have promised. But I'd perhaps extend it a little bit and suggest that it's also those individuals acting in your best interests behind your back. It may not be a specific deliverable or a specific topic that you're talking about with that individual, but you trust them not to, in sort of Caesar language, put that knife in you. Maybe I've been in the UK civil service for too long, where it happens all the time.
Right, we'll go to Charlie, who's already been referenced by Armin indirectly in the Trusted Advisor.
Yeah, well, let's see. I'll try and be quick. I think it's important to understand the big picture of trust. Think of three words that we confuse all the time. We've already confused a couple of them. Trust the noun, trust the verb, and trust the adjective. Trust the noun is the word we use for a relationship between two parties, like friendship or love. Trust, there's a state of trust between us, that kind of thing. That's the noun. The active components are the verb and the adjective. To trust somebody, to trust someone, or to trust some institution. That's an active kind of a thing. It's involved with risk-taking. So the essence of trusting is risk-taking. And then finally, trustworthiness, which is where the so-called trust equation comes in. These are the attributes which make others trust us. That's a passive set of virtues. So I find if you see in the press things like trust in banking is down, trust in government is down, you have to deconstruct that and say, well, is this a problem of trusting or of trustworthiness? If we say trust in banking is down, is that because banks are less trustworthy or because people are less inclined to trust banks? Those are two different things. And it's often both are the case, but they're different. And unless you figure out what the problem is, you can't solve it. And let me talk about the trustworthiness part of it, that half. That's where the trust equation comes in. We can dive deeper, but there are several models for trustworthiness, and they're all the same, including mine, in the following respect. They all have at least one variable that is what I'll call rational, behavioral, quantifiable, metricizable, numerate, that kind of thing. And there's at least one component which has to do with much more of the emotional things like sincerity, authenticity, other orientation, who are you in it for, yourself or me? And those are very hard to quantify. They show up in the firmness of your handshake, whether you pause a half a second before answering, whether you maintain eye contact, things like that. So it's a human phenomenon. It's a mixture of the rational and the emotional. And I'll stop there. We can dive deeper into any of that.
That's fascinating, because I did ask ChatGPT what behaviors were contributing to trustworthiness, and it came up with consistency, competence, honest and direct communication, respecting boundaries, active listening, demonstrating empathy, keeping promises and commitments, it went on and on and on.
Yeah.
But that's the sort of thing that you're thinking. That's fascinating, that you're separating out trust from from trustworthiness. And it's obvious, but I hadn't thought of it.
It is obvious, which is why it's powerful, but it also helps sort through activities and questions. It's simple and clean, which is why I like it. Very commonsensical. We can all agree to that.
Yeah. Armin.
I really like what you were saying, Charlie, and I think it resonates so well back then, and I think it still does, in particular in the consulting world, because consultants are typically extremely left-brain oriented, and they lack the right brain side that you just mentioned, how important that actually is. I actually learned over the time that it was more than just a marketing thing. What Carney at the time was always saying is a mantra, going back to Andrew Thomas Carney himself, that saying that our success as consultants will depend upon the essential rightness of the advice, i.e. the left-hand brain side we give, and our capacity for convincing those in authority that it is good. And the convincement and the good are both things that are not necessarily left brain, but right brain oriented.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. The work that I do over the years largely with consultative and professional services firms, it represents exactly what you said. When we have a self-assessment version of the trust equation, and I ask people to self-rate. And here's a blanket statement: all professional services people overrate the rational quantitative components, which we call credibility and reliability, and they underrate the emotional components, which we call intimacy and self-orientation. And of course, you need a balance. Interestingly, if you look at Gallup, for example, does a survey in the U.S. every year for the last 30 years, and the least trusted professions, everybody guesses. They're lawyers, politicians, and used car salesmen. Everybody gets that. What they don't get is when you ask them, what's the most trusted profession? They all guess doctors or teachers. No, it's nurses. With one exception, the year after 2000, after 9/11, it was firemen. But the year after that, it went back to nurses, and it's been nurses ever since. And if you think about the essence of a nurse, empathy, sincerity, identification, transparency of motives, we are literally and figuratively naked in front of nurses, and their job is to make it okay. And they do, by and large. So it's rather telling that you get exactly that component.
Armin was going to come in, but Ciaran.
One of the things you said there was kind of very interesting. It was around handshake and eye contact.
Yeah.
And that, for me, is always the first impression that you have with anyone. And whether it's right or wrong, I have made judgments on people based just on that 2-second interaction, which is,
we all do.
How do they shake my hand, and do they look me in the eyes when they're doing it? I mean, I've known people that, and I suffer with eye contact as well, because I think while I'm talking, and then that means my eyes drift off into the left brain. People shake my hand and not look at me, and afterwards, I've been wandering away, mumbling to myself, he needs watching.
That's how it works. Yeah. That's right.
Amen.
I think we all have seen or heard about the communication model that's a message is to be seen both how it is sent by the sender and how it is received by the receiver, and that in the end determines then whether the communication has worked out as intended or not. And I think the same applies here, and this is why I liked what you said earlier, Charlie, that it is an active component in there, that you can be trustworthy, but still not being trusted because you're communicating not well enough your trustworthiness.
Right.
I'd like to come in on, actually I want to come back on the trust equation, but I'd like to come in on Ciaran's point about the handshake and the initial introduction, because I remember being mightily impressed on a training course once when we had to sit down and somebody was going to come into the room from behind us, and we didn't know who it was going to be, but we were expecting a visitor, and we had to turn around and greet them. There were other people watching, the rest of the group. It's only natural that you should look at the person, look them up and down, see what they're wearing, see if they're carrying anything. And it's only a split second. Take them into your consciousness. And then it was repeated. And this time, the person who was greeting them was told, now, you're about to be visited by your favourite cousin. You haven't seen them since last Christmas and they gave you a lovely present and you've really been looking forward to this. Do the same thing again. And it was completely different. Yeah. And the sense of welcoming, unity was profoundly different. Very, very impressive. Sorry, Charlie, I was going to ask you about the trust equation.
Yeah, but it's well, again, it falls into the bucket of trustworthiness as opposed to trusting. There's four variables in the form of A plus B plus C over D, and those variables are credibility plus reliability plus intimacy, all divided by self-orientation. Credibility and reliability are the two rational, behavioral, quantifiable components, dependable certifications, expertise, capabilities, competence, that kind of thing. And those, again, those are easily tracked. We have, track records. Did they do what they say, et cetera? The other two, the intimacy and then the denominator. Intimacy is sort of a sense of emotional safety. Do you intuitively feel, yeah, I can share stuff with this person. They're not going to, turn around and surprise me or share it with somebody inappropriately. And the self-orientation goes to what Armin mentioned before. Who are they in it for? Are they in it for themselves? Are they devious? Or do I sense that they're actually, they're paying attention to me and doing something in my best interest? And as I mentioned, we made a self-assessment out of that. About 500,000 people have taken it, and we can now make some quantifiable statements about, the sequencing and the power of each of those components. Go ahead, Armin.
What you were just explaining was raising a question that I had, and there's a lot of work spent in the last 20 years on customer relationship management and supplier performance management. I'm really trying hard to remember whether I have seen anywhere any kind of system where these intimacy and self-orientation factors would have been tracked and measured in order to give a more holistic view on either a customer or a supplier. I've never seen anything like it. It was always just reliability and credibility.
Yeah, well, it's no accident. Those are easily measurable. And we live in a world in which the ruling mantra is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I happen to think that's ridiculous. Of course, you can manage it without measuring it, but we don't think that way. So we gravitate to the things that are metricizable. And we tend, to give short shrift, especially those of us in the professions, to the stuff that's harder to measure. I found that rather than try to measure intimacy or low self-orientation, storytelling, vignettes, role plays, video clips, everybody gets it intuitively. We all understand, how, the example that Bill just gave of people coming in the room. We get that. We learned that in kindergarten, but we don't talk about it, I think, because somehow business doesn't recognize, gee, if you can't empiricize it, what good is it? Well, it's there, it's real.
Well, I'm with you that it would be hard to measure. You still could simply ask the people that are interacting with a customer or with a supplier on how they feel about the persons on the other side. But even that is not happening. That's what I found just interesting, that it's something that is so important and is not getting tracked at all.
Yep. Yeah, you're right.
Two lines of thought, perhaps. Development maybe on the handshake issue, and Charlie was saying, you look at somebody and you get a feeling. If you've got eye contact, you get one impression, and if you don't, that's another impression. I think it goes beyond that, and I felt for quite a long time as a photographer, at least, the brain is extremely good at pattern recognition, and it can do it very, very quickly. So assimilating somebody's face and all the different nuances within it, not just eyes, generates a lot of information, I think, in the brain subconsciously about what that person is like. I've tried to research this a little bit in the past and got nowhere. I can find nothing on it. But I think you can take it as far as looking at pictures of two people interrelating, and you can work out, to some extent, the relationship between those two people from the expressions that are going on. I mean, obvious things like how close are they and are their heads tilted towards each other, but it goes much, much further than that. And Charlie in particular, perhaps, if you know of any sort of research on this, I'd be very, very interested in pursuing that. The second thread is trust of organizations. Right. And organizations are not people. Right. They have no body, as it were. And I've been saying to Bill, I've been reading a book called Sapiens. I don't know whether everybody else has read this. And he says, I forget his name, organizations are combinations of stories and myths. That's all they are. And what they try to do is create a brand which represents a shortcut to trust. And there's a really good sort of anecdotal story, I suppose, quite a few years ago now, 2009, when I looked it up again. We have an electronics retailer in the UK called Dixons, and Dixons were awful at customer service. And everybody in the country knew they were awful at customer service. And then Dixon's put an advert out to say how brilliant they were at customer service. And everybody in the country almost said, "You've got to be kidding." This was such a strong example of the company not getting it, but brand discontinuity. So I think, the issue I'm trying to put forward, I suppose, is a brand congruence, that companies who are supposed to do things that they are supposed to do. And consultancy is another one, Armin. Sorry to focus on consultancy, but you sort of know behind the scenes they're working to a land and expand model. Even though they might be acting in your best interests on a day-to-day basis, they're looking for opportunities to put new people into the mix. And that takes the trust down for me in working with consultancy firms.
Fascinating insight from a photographer, especially talking about facial features and looks and all the rest of it.
A very quick remark on the photography thing, and the practical tip for everyone who's not a professional photographer, as Pete will certainly confirm, pictures of a couple always look better when you ask them to really put their heads closer together than they typically would do.
Yeah.
A thought also struck me just looking at the relative lack of diversity on this call. We're all white Caucasians of a certain age, but there's also a cultural element as well.
Yes.
And maybe, Peter, with working for the Foreign Office, you might have greater experience of this than me, but we also, I've worked in China, I've worked in quite a few countries around the world. I've always tried to make myself a little bit more conscious about the context of the place that I'm in, because what's good for me, what's rules of the road for me, and is probably quite tolerable to all of you guys. The odd kind of sarcastic or cynical remark, that sort of thing, can maybe completely destroy an impression or destroy a relationship when it's a different culture that you're addressing. Also, to try and read the room.
Yeah.
Just going to add one other thing. I've always found that, as well as the handshake and the eye contact, when people actively listen to me, so that, they listen to what I say and then they feedback or paraphrase what I'm saying to say, it's almost like, can I just check with you that you've said this? I always find that helps me attach a greater value to anything they might say or do after that, because it means they're understanding me.
But that active listening or mirroring of your body language, aren't those also potential candidates for faking authenticity? Because you can do that without being trustworthy.
Oh yeah. But I'm thinking about it from my point of view. If the person's doing that to me, they're creating the conditions to build trust. Now, if they stab me in the back afterwards, then obviously there's going to be consequences.
Well, Armin, to your point, the one factor that people con men successfully try to emulate is faking self-orientation. They learn all the tricks, the handshake, the eye look, all that stuff, but they're doing it for devious means. So it is possible to fake it, although, Bernie Madoff is dead, last I looked. We have a pretty good way of sniffing out bullshit meters, pardon my French.
From a game theory perspective, I would distinguish here between one-off games and repeated games. For a one-off game, I think it is absolutely okay if you can ethically accept it, that you're taking some levers out of the box of dark psychology. But if you are in a repeated game and that is in business more the default than the exception, then you better keep that box closed.
Well, let me just comment on that. The Prisoner's Dilemma game, which Armin, of course, the solution to the Prisoner's Dilemma is play the game more than once, because of exactly what you said. And I would disagree, though, that in business, that is not a common perspective. We're so driven towards transactionalism that we forget that it's much more effective to play the relationship game. So you find people in sales, for example, that I work with a lot, they're focused on the deal. No, they should focus on the relationship, out of which many deals fall if you nurture the relationship. But Bill, I want to go back to the question that I think you raised, or I forget who raised it, but institutional trust versus personal trust. And you're absolutely right. They're different. I would suggest institutional trust is the weaker of the two, because it's heavily dependent on, there's some emotional stuff like brand image and stuff. But think about it. If I get packages delivered by FedEx and they put the box on my porch in the right place 3 times in a row, I trust them. But if they blow it, if they misplace the next one, suddenly I don't trust FedEx. On the other, and by the way, if I trust FedEx, that does not extend to the FedEx driver. I wouldn't trust that person to babysit my granddaughter, for example. On the other hand, if I know the FedEx driver and I kind of know his first name, we've talked a little bit about it. I know he has 2 kids, not a deep relationship, but I kind of know him. By extension, I do know FedEx, or I do trust FedEx. It does carry that way. And when I talk with people about change management, there are 2 options, outside in and inside out. The outside in, which is what the public relations world has settled on, is to fix create the message, even at the risk of incongruence, to declare victory, even if it's obvious you're lying. The inside out, which is much more effective, doesn't take that much longer, is to make sure that everybody individually behaves in trusting and trustworthy manners. And if you get a whole team to behave that way, it doesn't take that long for it to seep out in their relationships with customers, suppliers, etc. So the more effective way to think about trust is focus on the personal and let that extend to the institutional.
I just want to touch on something that Armin said when he talked about, gaming people, confidence tricking. No, I'm going to make a revelation here. In my personal life, I think you know what it is, Bill. I don't need to go into any further things, but I had a very, very stressful personal experience quite a few years ago. And I did some things during that where, let's put it this way, I didn't want to do them. I'm not ashamed of doing them, but I still know that I probably shouldn't have done them. It's kind of, I've described it as, I've gone to a place where I've known I don't want to be. And I found that I'm not going to confession or, saying rosaries to get forgiveness for it. But it's a thing of, I knew through my own morality and my own view of self-image that what I was doing was fundamentally not the right thing to be doing, not trustworthy, but I still felt it was important enough that I had to do it.
Can I pick that up and turn that into the personal versus corporate thing? Because a lot of people have their own personal ethics. And I think probably Ciaran recognizing the cruel to be kind thing and all the rest on a personal level is quite profound. But on a personal versus corporate thing, you have your own personal ethics. But many, many people, I'd say the majority, if not all people, are willing to do things for the company they work for that they would not do in their own right, in their own personal ethics. And I find that very troubling. And I don't know how to overcome it.
Yeah.
I don't know how to deal with it.
I struggle with this one, Bill. I think you're right. People do things that they wouldn't or shouldn't do in an alternative context. I mean, you've only got to look at the UK's Post Office Horizon inquiry, for those of you who tapped into that of late. I don't know if you've seen that, Charlie, but it's an awful situation involving people of what are supposed to be the chief executive, who was ordained, for goodness sake, going completely off-piste in terms of what appears to be morality. In a sort of overseas sense, a foreign office sense, if you like, how important is culture? Extremely important. It's easy to say, yeah, culture's extremely important. I lived in India for 2 years in Delhi, and you definitely can't behave like a Brit when you're in the middle of Delhi. And Mr. Modi is sort of saying this is the way it's going to work with the Hindu religion and all of that. But the point I was going to loop back on is a lot of the time it is, I think, all about context, and context is an under-evaluated sort of issue. So your FedEx man, for example, Charlie, leaving his package on the door, you've come to trust that he will do that if he's done it 3 times, I think. But if he was to appear in a restaurant and serve you meals, then the context is completely different. And the context, in my view, does not transfer automatically. Companies and their branding might imply that it does, but in general it doesn't. And we might have a solution, as was in the Foreign Office, that we were applying in one country, and make a big assumption that the same solution might apply in a different country. No, you've got to start again from scratch and prove that it does.
Second book recommendation, not only Trusted Advisor, but also I followed your recommendation, Bill, from one of our previous discussions and purchased a copy of the Unaccountability Machine book. And I think that gives the answer to the problem between the personal trust and the worthiness and the institutionalized trustworthiness, because since Taylorism, in an institution, everyone is only having a smaller and smaller share of responsibility for what is done. And obviously, it feels so much easier to do something squishy if you're just 1% of the problem and not accountable for 100% of it, as it would be if it would be a personal matter.
Bill, I wanted to mention a couple. You mentioned the desire to be practical and business oriented and so forth. I wanted to just toss out a couple of ways in which these observations have very real practical implications. I'll just toss out a few. There's maybe a dozen I could mention. But sequencing is important. For example, you think about what does it mean to send in a resume if you're applying for a job? That's all the quantitative, clear, rational, behavioral, historical knowledge. That gets you an interview. If you then go to the interview and all you do is keep reading off your resume, you've lost the job. Because at that point, that's the point you need to become personal and connect and do all the soft skill things. Now, analogously, that's how we should be approaching business development. For example, when I used to give keynote speeches, I'd make sure all the advanced press, all the publicity, Harvard MBA, author 3 books, consulting 20 years, blah, blah, blah. And then the first thing I do when I'm on stage is tell a stupid story about myself and how I screwed up. So to personalize it. And that's also how you get in the door by and large. You get in the door in the sales world by some form of the rational stuff, and then you get in front of people, and then you have to start showing who you are personally. One of the best things you could do, by the way, is recommend a competitor, because it goes to the issue Armin raised. If you're willing to recommend a competitor, there's no greater indication of selflessness, and other orientation. You're willing to say, I may not get this deal, I understand, but I got to tell you the truth. That's an interesting example. Another one, practical example, is it's received wisdom in the sales world. You don't mention price until you have established value. And what that has led to is all kinds of salespeople refusing to get into price until they've finished their spiel. So I recommend exactly the opposite. Tell them right up front, this is going to be a low 5-digit number. This is going to be a high 6-digit number, roughly. We'll nail it down. But because otherwise, people are just sitting there waiting, getting frustrated that you're not being straight with them. So put it out there. There are a bunch of other things we can talk about, but there's some very practical implications to all this stuff too.
It's just when you say that about recommending a competitor, and it happens actually quite a lot. German companies do it quite a lot, because I think although a lot of German companies that in Germany, industry has it's the Mittelstand, sort of, which are sort of mid-sized companies. They're not big. They're not big conglomerates like BASF or Bayer. They exist.
Right.
But a lot of these guys are used to actually working together with each other to achieve things. And I've been talking with one German supplier, and they said, no, we can't actually really achieve that. Yeah. But if you go to such and such, they can do it. Now, they'll maybe compete in some areas of the market, but they're also working together in other areas of their particular markets.
It's a big feature of clusters, there's engineering clusters near Stuttgart, and there's design clusters near Milan, clusters of industry. So wherever you get that, you do get this cross-recommendation thing.
By the way, another very practical thing I always tell people, when a client asks you, what experience do you have doing this area? If you don't have any, say, I don't have any. Nobody says that. But if you're willing to say, I don't know, that immediately, paradoxically, increases your credibility, whereas everybody assumes it decreases it. No, it doesn't. If you're willing to admit the boundaries of your knowledge, suddenly you become credible. Whereas if you tap dance and try and pretend, well, I know this, that, and the other, that's just smoke and mirrors, more BS. We don't trust it.
Now, I remember my very first ever ISO quality audit, and the ISO manager for the company I was working for had us all in a room, and he was explaining to us how the audit was going to work. And when he sort of went round the table, I said, well, I think this is fairly straightforward. I can probably BS my way out of any difficult questions. The guy said to me, no, that's not what you do. If you don't know something, you say, I don't know, but I will get you the answer before the end of the audit.
And the important part is not that you'll get him the answer. The important part is saying, I don't know, pause. Yep. By the way, if it's important, I can get it for you. Yep. But the important part is willing to admit up front, I'm not God. I don't know everything, and I'm not going to BS you.
Why is it so difficult to do that? Why are salesmen apparently taught puff and bluff?
To me, the most interesting application of trust comes in selling, because of exactly what you said, Bill. The entire enterprise of selling, almost entirely, is built around a transactional, zero-sum game model. I must convince you. What do I have to do to take money out of your pocket successfully? The way it's set up, it's guaranteed to, create opposition and lack of collaboration, et cetera. I think it all comes down to fear. I've learned over the years, the root negative human emotion is probably fear. Take anger, envy, jealousy, anything else you want, scratch the surface and look deep enough below, and you'll find fear. And in the professional services, I remember going through this personally. when I first discovered what my billing rate was, I thought, oh my God, I'm not worth that many hundreds of dollars per hour. Who are they kidding? And then it was even worse when I figured out what a multiple of what they were charging me was compared to what I was getting paid. I thought, this is not fair. But so the sales in a lot of intangible areas are inevitably personal. If I don't get the sale, I feel on some basis they rejected me. And by the way, they did. That's true. So there's a whole lot of ego stuff involved here. And the answer is not get a thick skin. The answer is grow your own ego strength so that you can tell the truth and detach from the outcome. The outcome is going to be what it's going to be. The outcome is what it should be for the client, not what you want it to be. So part of it is feeling comfortable not forcing your will upon other people. And all the language of sales, there's all these military and competitive sports analogies that just pepper the world of sales. And they're all distracting. They're all fear-based, competitive. Think about handling objections like it was handling snakes. No, objections are conversations. The real enemy is not objections, it's disengagement. It's when people stop talking to you. That's where the problem comes in.
You're probably only going to buy one car every 5 years. So, they know that they're not going to see you again for 5 or 6 years. So get it off them. You're going to buy one washing machine every 10 years, let's say. They know they're not going to see you again when it comes to doing that. You probably have more authentic interactions with salespeople in supermarkets because they know you're going to come there every week to buy your eggs and bread.
Except for the very best people, even in the car business, are those who don't go by that rule. The very, very successful people keep track of their customers. They keep index cards or whatever the modern, and they stay in touch with them, and they call them up and they ask them how it's going. They establish a personal relationship, and you do come back after 5 years. A lot of people do. Meanwhile, you're right, the average salesperson goes by the rule, buyers are liars. Or the saying in the car business, there are no be-backs. Customer says, we'll be back. No, you won't. So they try and get you the sale before you get out of the door. And they use all these stupid tactics that we inherently distrust.
And I think you're raising a very important point here because earlier you were referencing on the sales side of the professional services. And I'm completely with you. There's a lot of things that can be done better. But I also would not take the buying side out of the equation and what I would call the predictable rationality of these buyers. In consulting, if you would think about it from a logical perspective, the very most trust-building act that you could potentially offer to a client is to make your support completely contingent on the outcome.
Yep.
And while that is a very convincing story, it rarely is getting used, and the clients are not going for it because they fear that it would mean that you are so successful that you're paying too much.
Yeah, yep. And there are a couple other ways to do that too. Offer an unconditional guarantee, no matter what the reason. And you don't even have to tell me. You pay me whatever you think it was worth, period. I've offered that for 40 years. 2 people have taken me up on it, ever. And they were both, and I agreed. They paid nothing.
So there is something I think we also need to educate the buyers to spend a little bit more time on thinking about being trustworthy and what trust is actually worth it, and then how to respond to these kind of offers. Because if they then just go back into their cameralistic and just think about budgets and everything needs to be plannable, they're missing a point.
The reason I'm remembering Bill and I got connected first was a procurement question. Again, professional services, but a lot of people, their goal is to bypass the procurement office because they're the gatekeepers. And I've often felt, no, go to the procurement people and say, hey, I know you're here for a job. How can I help you? In fact, why don't you and I sit down together and we'll talk about the proposal and even write it together. I know it's still a proposal. You can reject it, but it'll be a better proposal if we write it together. And by the way, you should do that with every other vendor too. You should you get free consulting, you get a much better proposal. And by the way, don't forget who gave you that idea.
I want to come in with a question relating to that, Charlie. But Peter, you're looking thoughtful and haven't said, are you okay? Anything you wanted to ask before I come in with a question?
Well, there's thoughts going here, there, and everywhere in my head all the time, actually, Bill. But
okay.
Just Charlie's story there about talking to the procurement people. There's an inherent trust issue in there that when you talk to the procurement, even if you're going to work with them, that they're not going to run off with your idea. And many of them do. So I think it works the other way around, which is your point, Armin, that the procurement folk have to build trust with the vendor base in order to be effective as well.
Let me just jump on that with the And let me go back to my basic model. There's trusting and there's trustworthiness. The active participant is the trustor, not the trustee. That's the passive one. If all you do is to be trustworthy, it's like aggressively waiting for the phone to ring. Not a good sales strategy. So if we want to establish trust, we, whoever we are, need to be the ones who take the first risk. And that's a good example. If you go and say to the procurement person, listen, this is proprietary. I hope I will trust that you could keep this, between us, because this is our proprietary stuff. You call it out and you overtly trust them. The fundamental, the biggest driver of trust is reciprocity. If you listen to me, I will listen to you. If you treat me well, I will treat you well. If you trust me, I will trust you. And it's a powerful dynamic, and one in which we as sellers have the power to take the first risk.
The question I was going to ask is about generosity. But Ciaran, you were going to come in.
I was just going to make a point there that when someone very early on in an interaction is kind of quite forceful in saying, you have to trust me on this. Now, depends if they're a surgeon, if they're a surgeon,
maybe.
then yes,
Right.
maybe. But that for me always seems to raise a red flag. And, no, I don't have to do anything here.
Right. The two most trust-killing words are trust me.
Yeah.
That's that, and I want to come in here on this generosity thing because I've forgotten where I read it. It was possibly in your book, Charlie, I don't know. But if you set out to be generous, you are the first mover. You are taking the risk, and you are putting something out there. And there is a real risk, and it happens, that the person says, thank you very much. That's a really useful piece of advice. I don't actually need to pay you, do I? Because, we haven't signed a contract yet. Well, no, that can happen. But in my experience, people don't behave much like that. And if they do, you didn't really want to be doing business with them.
Right. That's who you want to refer your competitor to.
Yeah. And the second thing is, if you are generous and you're trying to help somebody, you are in effect performing as a consultant.
Correct.
You are in effect letting them try before they buy. You're doing your level best to help them in their current situation. Now, I don't think it matters whether you're selling a car or whether you're selling consultancy. It's the same thing applies. I always look for generosity in somebody and the consistency of that generosity and the congruence with their other elements of their lifestyle. And if all of those come together, I will trust that person a lot.
Yeah.
And so I tend to focus the whole thing on generosity. I try and be generous when I possibly can, and it's not easy. And I tend to look for generosity in other people. Is that fair? Is that a fair way of going forward?
I think what Charlie mentioned earlier, the reciprocity is important here because your generosity should be met by something that the other side is doing there as well. And to give a very concrete example, I'm not naming the company, but I know from one German company that they're changing their preferred professional advisors, strategy company, every 3 to 4 years in order to take maximum advantage of the generosity of these advisors getting in there and being the preferred supplier. And having the overarching strategy in place, which does not necessarily even is known by the individual buyer at the time, that they are going to replace them with the next one in line 3-4 years later.
For a while, that becomes clear. Everybody can see that after a while, and
after a while,
after
a while, and long after. That's the problem. What you mentioned earlier in today's hectic world. The responsibility for something that happens today or tomorrow is comparatively low if people know that they are going to move on within a few years to somewhere else anyway.
On Wall Street, there was an acronym describing that phenomenon: IBG, YBG. I'll be gone, you'll be gone. Let's do the deal. Nobody will not be around to suffer the consequences. But one of the best examples I've seen of the dilemma you're pointing out, Armin, is Gutfreund, I think it was, the managing director of Goldman Sachs 30, 40 years ago. He had this phrase, long-term selfish. He said, we are long-term selfish. We want to make money. We want to be greedy. We want to be rich. That's why we're in the business of investment banking. But he said, we recognize that the way for us to get rich is in the long term. It's by making our clients rich in the meantime. which means it means detaching our detachment from an individual transactional outcome, focusing on the long-term good of our clients and believing that if we do that, we'll get enough business out of it that we'll do just fine. And since then, of course, Goldman has forgotten the second part of that saying, but he was right.
He was mentioned in Moneyball, wasn't he? Quite a lot.
Yes, yes, yes.
Fascinating. We should think about winding up and perhaps asking each of you. I never expected in Swishu's podcast to reach a conclusion or anything, but it's essentially helping ourselves to think about things we hadn't thought about before. And it's done that for me very effectively. So I'd like to ask each of you if you'd like to say a few words about trust and what you thought after today. Who will I start with? Armin, would you like to kick off?
Happy to do so. I very much enjoyed today's discussion, and again, it has broadened the perspective in many different areas. From a game theory perspective, trust is a very important factor because when you are in a negotiation, you try to find a solution within the ZOPA, the zone of potential agreements, and that means that everyone has their least acceptable. And the more you trust the other side, the more you are willing to get close, if necessary, to your least acceptable, or even lower it to a certain extent because there is less of a risk buffer that you have to put into your calculation. Therefore, there's a direct economic value of being trustworthy and finding out about the trustworthiness. The most important takeaway for me is that the next time I'm seeing a company doing either CRM or supplier performance management, I will think about and consider how to implement these factors into the equation, into the balanced scorecard. As I said earlier, I've not seen that anyone doing yet. If someone has done it, please make yourself known. Would be very interested to learn about it.
Peter, could I ask you to final thoughts?
Final thoughts, Bill, yes. No, it has been a very interesting conversation. Interesting is not a good word, as it doesn't mean anything, but it's made me think about this trust component much more than I had before. I was thinking before the session that if you're in a procurement role, at least, trust is an ever-present component. Just as a personal anecdote, when I was saying I went to Central Asia last October, and I did quite an odd reverse auction for the supplier of my trip. This company I'd never heard of, very small, did have a web page, but that was about it. I knew that I would end up at some point giving this organisation, who I'd never met and probably wasn't going to meet until I actually got there, quite a large amount of money. How did I know they were going to be there, going to deliver for me when I got there? And I didn't. I just ended up saying to myself, Peter, this is a trust issue. So have you got enough facts around this procurement to enable that trust to proceed? And I think in our professional roles, I've certainly been very much part of my job, actually. You do a lot of due diligence, and that due diligence becomes your substitute for trust. You look for congruence. Does his address exist? Does he have a phone number which actually looks correct? Does he have the right number of digits? And all of these little things. And any slight problem, immediately the lack of trust looms at you like a monster. So that's my summary. I think in a business context, Bill, then, which is where we started, trust is ever present, and we've made a good bit of progress today in defining what that trust is and how we should get a grip on it in order to build it into our transactions.
That example of yours, Peter, sounds very like forensic accounting, which is an interesting term I learned about a long time ago. Yeah. Ciaran, you like to add some words?
Thank you for your presence today, Charles. I think we've had a very thought-provoking conversation. My main reflection on this is I've been lucky that throughout my entire career, I've worked for the most part for trustworthy companies. And, I haven't worked for rip-off, fleece them and Git. And I think I think I've been lucky that way.
Super, thanks. And Charlie, would you like to say a few words at the end?
Sure. This has been interesting. I mean, we've touched on so many different elements of trust. I couldn't have mapped it out better. I think we touched on all kinds of relevant issues. If I had to kind of sum it up, let me mention, Armin, I do have some ideas about quantification. If you want to get in touch with me later, I'm happy to send that to you. I usually tell people, they'll say, what's the single best thing we can do? And, and it's a fair question. It's pay attention, listen, not so that you hear things, but so that the other person feels they have been heard. That's a huge thing. People want to feel acknowledged, heard, appreciated, noticed. So if I had to one-line it, that's probably it. And I could say some other things, but we'll stop there.
I just want to add one little anecdote of my own. We had a relationship with a Japanese company, a supplier of a really, really important chemical. We were making pharmaceutical type margins from processing this chemical into something else. And we heard on the market that it was going to be in short supply. So we went to the supplier, and Hakido-san, or whoever he was from the Japanese company, came and sat in our office in the south of England. And we said, we've heard the product is going to be in short supply. What do we have to do? Can we pay you a bit more? Can we have a super contract over and above the current one? And he said, no, I couldn't do any of those things. I said, so what are you suggesting? He said, I'm suggesting nothing. I'm suggesting that you will not be short of product. We will supply what you want under the current contracts, under the current terms. And there was a colleague of mine, Peter, and we both looked at him, and we didn't know how to report this to the board. We said, this has put us in a difficult situation. You're a Japanese businessman from a respected Japanese company, and we just have to take your word for it. I looked at Peter, and he looked at me, and we both said, I believe you. We're just going to take this to the board and say, we trust him.
Yeah.
And we did, and the board did. And it all worked. It was not an instant situation. It was one that we'd been developing trust over a number of years.
So
that
can
was,
I one in at the end there, a personal example. My own little business, I sold about 4 years ago to one of my chief lieutenants. And she and I are both steeped in all the trust stuff. And we decided we didn't need a legal agreement. And maybe some details you need an accountant for and a lawyer for, but we agreed on the terms and the financial arrangements and all that. It was a handshake. I know her, she knows me, I trust her, she trusts me. And so we took that to the lawyers, and they said, well, you can't do that. You have to have an agreement. And we said, no, I don't think we do. And, it's worked out great. And the bonds, I think, between her and I, my commitment to her, her commitment to me, transcend anything any lawyer could have written into specific terms. It works.
It worked. Good. Well, look, on that positive point, I would like to thank Charlie Green, Peter Walmsley, Armin Scharlach, and Ciaran Crossin for a fascinating discussion. Yeah. And that brings us to the end of Trust on this Swiss Shoes podcast. Until the next one, thank you for listening.